Welcome back. All right, so this is a news of the day type video. You'll notice that the only logo on the board is NHL because this is all National Hockey League related items. That's the Hockey Guy jersey that I usually wear when it's just a general NHL related video. So the GM meetings concluded today. Nothing pushed forward in terms of rule changes. There's a lot of maybes out there, but there's nothing major. They're happy with how things are going. Even when asked about the playoff format, Kyle Dubas asked about playing Tampa Bay. His answer was, "You want to play the best," and so he has no problem with it. So again, we will discuss that during this video as well. So players are still likely $100 million in the hole at the end of this year. That's what Gary Bettman's saying. So I've heard all of this. The NHL's really greedy. That's why the cap's not going up, because people forget. Um, the NHL lost a lot of revenue in 2020 and 2021, both from the NHL pausing and losing games, the bubble, and then there was the season without the fans in attendance. That wasn't free. There was a lot of expenses there and a lot of revenue that didn't come in. The salary cap stayed exactly the same. It was artificially raised to that level. So for a league that's as greedy as people say, it's odd that they didn't go to the NHLPA and say, okay, the league's only generating, say, $500 million this year, so your salaries are way down. We're going to just adjust the cap and it's down to like $20 million a team. That didn't happen. The NHL kept it flat. GMs have not dealt well with it being flat. That's why we're seeing so many teams that are capped out. And the trade deadline ended up being crazy because all of the trades were restricted to that final week. Now, they were owed $1 billion. The league was owed $1.5 billion in money, and now at the end of this season, it's likely still $100 million. So that's why the salary cap is only projected to go up by $1 million next year, is because the players haven't paid it back, and that was the agreement when the CBA was signed, that it was you got to pay this back because it's a 50-50 partnership. And since owners lost all that money and the players didn't lose all that money, although escrow is in there as well, right? Um, this is why the salary cap stayed flat. Because I keep seeing all kinds of posts online about the league's nothing but greedy. This is just greed by the owners. Why aren't the players getting more money? Did you complain the players were getting too much money over 2020 and 2021? If your answer is no, well, there you go. So there is a window here though. There's the new NHLPA head, which hasn't had discussions with Gary Bettman yet. Bettman has said he is willing to discuss with the new head of the NHLPA, pushing up the salary cap by as much as $4.5 million next season. However, it would mean an increase in escrow, and this is where players will get cold feet because escrow payments, they hate them. They absolutely detest him. Ask Artemi Panarin. He doesn't have good feelings about the escrow system where a certain amount of money is shaved off of your paychecks and it goes into a fund that you may never get back. And so that's the thing in escrow. And when you do get it back, it might be a year later. It might be a year and a half later. I've talked about escrow in videos before. I understand they're really good for people who are having problems with insomnia, which I've been told my videos are good for anyways. I've been putting people to sleep for decades. I raised kids. My voice has been putting people to sleep for decades. But at any rate, that's the problem, is that the NHL is saying, okay, if they want the extra money, if they want the salary cap to go up by more, we're willing to do that. But in order to do that, the players are going to have to give too, which means more escrow. So my guess is it's $1 million raise in the salary cap next year, and that's it. Unless we see that $100 million has been actually repaid and there actually is no money owing, and then the salary cap goes through the roof. I've said this in many videos, and yet I still see people online complaining the NHL is just so greedy and they're making all this money and the players aren't getting. So, at any rate, that's out there, and so we will find out over the next, I would say, month or two if there's any chance that the salary cap goes up by more. But I really think the NHLPA hearing, well, the escrow is going to go up then, we'll say forget it. We'll just take one more year of the flat cap, and then it'll go through the roof. Because then the escrow payments drop way off. So, yeah, that's the decision the NHLPA has to make. Now, when asked about expansion, I was actually kind of surprised by this one, in that he's saying places like Atlanta, Houston, Quebec City have shown interest. So this means the league does get calls here and there, or does have discussions with potential owners regarding an expansion team. And what's interesting too is saying it's not a front burner issue right now. He's not saying we'll never expand again. Because I've seen a lot of, well, the NHL will never expand again. And I thought at 32 teams they were done. But reading between the lines in this, it tells you, yeah, if we see an opportunity to expand again, we're not against it. And so that's out there, but that it's not an issue right now. My guess is that with this set, with the flat cap, and with all the other things that we talk about all the time on this channel with the NHL, they want to get all their cards in order. They want to make sure all their franchises are stable, that all their franchises have owners. And so adding more teams right now doesn't make a lot of sense, right? This isn't the 90s where they added 9 teams over a period of a decade, which for people who are too young to remember that was ridiculous. That was absolutely bonkers. And so when I hear people saying, oh, well, if you add a third team in 7 years, that's going to dilute the talent. 9 teams in a decade really diluted the talent level. And yet I do think that the National Hockey League now has more talent in it than ever, and I think that there is enough talent outside of the National Hockey League that we could expand by a team or two more, and I don't think it's going to negatively impact the product on the ice. Although there is a correlation between expansion and scoring going up. If you look historically, when expansion comes in, scoring does usually go up. GMs are not pushing forward with expanded reviews. 2 things they wanted to look at for reviews were puck over glass and high sticks. So, friendly fire on the high stick, or he didn't even touch him with his high stick, reviewing those. Stephen Walkham, who's in charge of officials, who's been quite transparent this week. They even showed how in between periods the officials are talked to about what they may have missed. The way they're calling the game, there is in-game management of the officials. And he said that in terms of puck over glass, by his count, there's 3 that were called incorrectly the entire season. And that the double minor for high sticking, which can be reviewed, there's, I think he said 76 or 87, somewhere in that range, that have been double minors this year. But if you looked at high sticking, you're looking at about 750. And so the concern is that the NHL wants to keep the games running quickly. Now, just personally, as a fan watching the game, there are way too many commercial breaks now. It feels like they keep squeezing in more and more commercial breaks, and it's kind of starting to drive me a little bit bonkers. But the game does go pretty quick. It is usually around 2.5 hours from when that anthem finishes until the game is done. And so it's nicely finished that way. And they don't want to add a bunch more stoppages that are going to slow things down. So that's not, at this point in time, likely to take place. They're going to do more investigating and see if there is a way to improve the process. There was discussion as well about, maybe giving coaches an extra challenge for this or that, or whether or not Toronto would do the actual looking at and investigating. For instance, there are times where a goal will happen and everything kind of stops and the officials go over and it's like, is this a review? And it's Toronto that's decided they need to review the goal. So maybe it would happen that way with certain penalties. But again, they want to keep the game going, right? They want to keep the game rolling and going in real time. They do need to consider the one thing being, if there's a goal that's controversial, that shouldn't have counted, or vice versa, that they take one off the board that should have counted for something that could have been reviewed and that review could have got the call right. In this day and age, you've got to make sure that call is right. There was also discussion of extending the overtime period to 7 minutes. The discussion had been 10. However, and now it's 7. Previously, I remember them talking about 10. My guess is the NHLPA not a big fan of the extra 5 minutes. Broadcasters may not be a big fan of the extra 5 minutes either. But it would be easier to sell both on 2 minutes, right? And the idea being you want to get rid of as many shootouts as possible. People don't generally like... I know there's people who defend the shootouts, but there are a lot more people who don't. Don't like shootouts to decide the game. The ECHL is testing 7-minute overtimes, and it seems to help. I will say this, if you add an extra 2 minutes to overtime, you're going to see a lot more games ended in overtime. We will routinely see the same sets of 3 guys being thrown over the boards every other time, and they'll tire out, right? So either one of 2 things happens. Either a coach is going to, be throwing guys on the ice who are probably still tired for their previous shift, or you throw guys on the ice who haven't played in the overtime so much and maybe a little bit more suspect, and so you're more likely to have maybe a turnover and something happen there. So I'm okay with the overtime being extended to 7 minutes. Now, one conversation out of this morning, of course, is Bettman saying things are working okay with the current playoff format. So I did a quick look at the standings and point totals and all that. And if the playoffs were held today and we were using 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7, 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5, first off, we already have 1 versus 8 and 2 versus 7 in that the division winners face the wild card teams. And so you have 1 versus 8, 2 versus 7. So that's already locked in. 3 versus 6, 4 versus 5. It changes in the West. It doesn't change in the East. You still have New Jersey against the Rangers. You have Toronto against Tampa Bay. And if Toronto wins that first round, they'd still get Boston in the second round in a 1 versus 8 scenario. The difference being that in the current scenario, they would get the Islanders in the second round if the Islanders knocked off Boston. In a 1 versus 8, and if you did the reseeding, they could get Carolina in the second round if it was New Jersey. Nope. Yes. Trying to think here. No, Carolina would get the Islanders. They would get New Jersey. Point being, there isn't an easy way to the Stanley Cup final. There just isn't one that's way easier. I always find that interesting because we've seen how many upsets over the years. There's no such thing as an easy opponent. So in the West, it would change in that Colorado would play LA rather than playing Minnesota, and Edmonton would play Minnesota instead of playing LA. So those two switch, but everything else stays the same. So again, from an NHL perspective, it works. And again, GMs had no interest in changing the format. Most GMs, at least at these meetings and publicly, supporting the format, right? So viewership numbers. Of course, viewership numbers that came out not too long ago were down 20%, and that was off the start of the season. So there's a lot of people who've latched onto that 20% number and said, see, people are tuning out from the NHL. They're tuning out, the product's terrible. However, those numbers have changed. ABC's viewership is up 19% over last year at this time. NHL on TNT, their Sunday programming, is up 42% over where it was last year. The ESPN Plus numbers are up as well. The March 9th game between Boston and Edmonton was the most watched game on ESPN Plus / Hulu yet, and they're in year 2. So the numbers are up, and it seems like certain matchups are really interesting. People, Detroit and Boston, the recent Detroit and Boston game, one of the highest rated games of the season, and of course the stadium game was highly viewed as well. So the overall numbers right now are actually up. The overall numbers are up in the States, both on ABC, NHL on TNT, and ESPN Plus. The numbers are higher. So yes, the numbers did show a dip. I think it was in November that they were talking about how the numbers were down. And again, a lot of people latched on and said, see, there's a problem. But the numbers are up right now. So for the National Hockey League, that's good. So when those numbers go up, that means that ABC, TNT, they can charge more for advertising, right? That's how that works. This program generates more money and therefore generates more viewers, and therefore it's worth more money for advertisers. And that's money that doesn't go to the National Hockey League. As far as I know, that all just goes to the networks. The networks already paid the NHL for the right to broadcast it. Now, the ads on the boards, that money goes to the National Hockey League. That doesn't go to the channels, right? The ads on the glass, that goes to the teams, all goes into the NHL coffers. But the viewership being up means the networks will make more money. ABC, TNT, ESPN will make more money on advertising that way. And so then they're happy with their end of the deal. They also talked about the regional sports network problem. And it is a problem. When you look at how much money has been lost in the Bally's deal, and Bally's will survive till the end of this season. So the National Hockey League's looking at how they can put on the broadcasts, while Gary Bettman acknowledges it is expensive to put on a broadcast, and that this is part of the reason why regional sports networks are struggling, because the costs are high. Travel costs, equipment, staffing, everything, it's high. I'm old enough to remember when you would watch a broadcast, and by broadcast, I mean they had one camera in the building, and it was static. It was a static camera that would just turn back and forth. There was no announcers, there was nothing. I don't know that the NHL goes to that at some point, but we may see a modified version. I could see there being at some point in time, if things keep trending this way, that you'd have your national broadcasters that make their money and they're happy with things, but the regional falls by the wayside, and so you might get a broadcast where you might have one play-by-play guy, you may not have a color announcer, and you might have 2 or 3 cameras, and you might have a much more streamlined experience. And I don't know that that would necessarily be really bad. But of course, if you have a job in the broadcasting industry, it wouldn't be great. But it's something that I think the NHL is going to have to consider at some point, because yeah, regional sports. One thing like Bally's was, bought Fox Sports and changed over to Bally's, or well, Sinclair bought Fox Sports, changed over to Bally's, and got all the broadcasting rights. And I don't see anybody stepping in and saying, well, we'll take all these regional broadcasts from Bally's. We'll do it. I don't see that happening. And so regional sports, there's been a movement away from it. And now it's about, how do you get all these games on TV? How do you make sure that everybody can watch all 82 games for their favorite teams and still generate enough money? So there you go. Let me know your thoughts in the comments section below, as always. Don't forget to hit like and subscribe if you're browsing your way through, you just happened upon this video. Thank you guys so much for watching, for all your support. I will talk to you again soon.